This lecture is going to be about trust. This is a particular relationship that I'm really interested in because a lot of my research, including my dissertation, was focused on the idea of understanding trust and its dynamics in social networks. This relates to tie strength, which we're also discussing this week, but it's a little bit different. So let's start with definitions. Defining trust is a complicated thing, and in the path of my research, I've read dozens of books that work on the definition of trust. And so I want us to think a little bit about how we would define trust, what we think it means, and how it plays a role in our interactions. So this is again one of those places where I want you to pause the lecture and write some notes down. These should be a little bit more extensive than notes that you've come up with before. And you also might want to go to the discussion board for the class and look at notes that other people have written down on trust definitions, because this is a good exercise for us to do as a group. Now obviously, since we're distributed and doing this online, we can't really focus on this and have a big discussion, but go back and forth between the discussion board, share your thoughts, and some things will emerge here. I'm going to try to guide through things that normally come out in a face-to-face discussion, and then we'll carry that discussion through on the discussion board as well. So here's the exercise I want you to do. Think about what are the things that you would do with someone you trust, but would not do with someone you don't trust. So some examples. You might loan money to a person that you trust, but not to someone you don't trust. Ask for a movie or restaurant or hotel recommendation. Tell a secret. Ask for a recommendation letter for a reference. Ask for advice. Have them take care of your pets or your house. You might lend them your car or go on a trip. Come up with a few more of these, maybe 5 of them. They can be broad or they can be very specific. So you might ask them to water your favorite plant, and that's a really specific thing, but it could be much more general. So jot some of those down, look at what other people have shared, and then come back and we'll keep discussing this. Okay, so hopefully you took some time to note those things down. Now the next thing we want to do is try to categorize these together. The specific examples that you will have shared on the discussion board are things that we can kind of group together. But there are some general categories of trust, and here are some ways of thinking about what we've put together. So when we talk about loaning money, for example, we do that because we expect the person will pay us back. If we ask for a recommendation for a movie or a restaurant, we think that the person's recommendation will match our own taste, and thus following their advice is something that will work out for us. If we tell people a secret, we expect that they'll keep that secret, not tell others, and not judge us for it. And if we ask for a reference or a letter of recommendation, we expect that it'll be positive and help us get the position that we're applying to. What are common things that appear in all of these scenarios? And you can work these scenarios out for any other examples you might have come up with. Some of it is that we're making ourselves vulnerable. So if we're loaning money, we're vulnerable to losing that money. If we ask for a restaurant recommendation, we're vulnerable to going to some place that we really don't enjoy. If we tell a secret, we're vulnerable to that secret getting out and also to being judged harshly for whatever we shared. And if we're asking for a letter of recommendation or a reference, we're vulnerable to that person saying something bad about us and we can't do anything about it. So there's an element of vulnerability or risk in all of this. For each of these examples, and probably all the other ones you've come up with, there's also an element of expectation that the other person will act in a way that's good for us. So they'll say something right, they'll give us a good recommendation, or they'll generally behave well so that our vulnerability won't be negatively exposed. These two components, the element of risk and the belief about the other person's actions, make up the core of a pretty widely accepted common definition of trust. Now the phrasing will vary, but those components are present in most definitions. So we're going to work with the definition that trust is putting oneself in a vulnerable position based on the belief that another person will act with our best interest in mind. So there's a vulnerability or a risk, and there's a belief in the trusted person that they'll do the right thing. Now that's a very general definition, but I mentioned if we go through all of these examples that you hopefully have provided from the previous slides, that there's actually different categories of trust. These were established by Johnson, George, and Swap in 1982, and we can probably group most of your suggestions into one of these 4 categories. One is trust with material possessions. So that is, I trust you with my car, or with money, or I'll lend you a sweater, and I think you're going to take care of it. One is belief about reliability. So if I ask to meet you at a place, that you'll show up there on time. If I ask you to water my plants or take care of my dog, that you'll really take care of them and follow through on your obligations. Trust with secrets is exactly what it sounds like. I expect that you'll keep a secret and that I won't be judged unfairly for it. And then 4th is trust regarding physical safety. So I'll go out with someone to a bar because I know they're not going to get drunk and punch me or do something else. Now, there's certainly some overlap in these categories, and the discussion board will also have a topic where we can look at some of that and place elements in those overlapping categories. So, for example, I might trust you with material possessions and with physical safety if I trust you, say, to be a designated driver when we go out. Then I'm trusting you with my car, but also my physical safety to drive me home. So there's overlap in all of these, and there may be some examples that are kind of on the border, but usually we can fit trust elements pretty cleanly into at least one of these 4 categories. The next thing to think about is how trust develops. So let's look at a few of these examples. First, there's calculation-based trust. So this is a rational decision about whether or not to trust someone, where the costs and benefits of trusting are factored in. So we're really calculating, is this a person that I should trust or rely on? You can imagine soldiers who are operating in a foreign country really having to make these calculations when they're interacting with locals. Is this a person that I should trust and rely on? And factoring in as much information as possible. There's personal-based trust. So this is a person's propensity to trust that's developed over the course of their life. Some people are just more trusting than others. We ran one experiment in my lab where we had people rate the trustworthiness of others on a scale of 1 to 10. And some people assigned all of their values between 5 and 10. They never assigned anything lower than a 5. And we had other people who assigned all their values between 1 and 5. Nobody, even their best friends, no one ever scored above a 5. So some people just have more of a propensity to trust. Sometimes that can be naive, but sometimes they're just relying on people more often. Other people are really cynical and not willing to make themselves vulnerable in that way and don't believe that other people are going to act in their best interest. This is really a personal attribute of each individual. There's cognition-based trust. So this is the kind of instant rapport and trust that develops between people who share similar backgrounds, beliefs, and values. And it's often based in first impressions. So this sort of thing happens when, you're walking in, you're meeting a new group of people, there's someone you sit down and talk with, and you kind of feel like you've known each other forever. You're willing to share secrets with them and have really deep conversations that you normally wouldn't have with a stranger. And that usually results from having some similar background or belief system, as well as personal chemistry that makes trust evolve without a lot of background to rely on. And finally, there's institution-based trust. This is how trust forms in the presence of guarantees and protections offered by an institution. So you guys may trust me as a professor, even if you have never had me before, because you know that if I start giving you bad grades or if I delete all of these lectures and you can't take any class material, that the university is going to do something about it. The same thing might go for police or government, though that trust tends to fade sometimes. But if an institution there guarantees that a person is going to behave well, we tend to trust people there more because we know that the institution will help us handle some of the risk that we're putting ourselves out there for. So these are 4 ways that trust develops. All 4 of these can factor into how we develop trust in an individual, but these are ways of separating it out. Another important thing to note about trust is that it's asymmetric. While we like to think of trust as equal, where we have ourselves and, say, a friend or a family member, and we basically trust each other the same amount, that's not always true. An extreme example of this is parents and children. So if you have a parent who has a really young child, the child has to trust their parents for everything, and generally does, while the parents practically have very little trust in the children. They can't trust their kids to take care of anything, to cook dinner, to clean up the house if the kid's 2 or 3 years old. So the trust is very asymmetric in that situation. More common asymmetries tend to be smaller than this. For example, bosses and employees. Employees tend to have more trust in their bosses than their bosses have in them. And that emerges in a lot of surveys. So trust does not have to be the same. Sometimes it is, but it doesn't always have to be like that. Other things about trust is that it changes over time. So I may trust someone very much today, and they could say something really horrible to me that kills that trust off, and I don't trust them anymore. Another really obvious example of this is, say, people who are married and one spouse cheats, then you end up with an immediate decrease in the amount of trust that one person has for another. Trust will also vary among contexts. So I may trust Bob to recommend a restaurant, but not trust him to babysit my dog. But it can transfer between contexts. So if I know Bob from work, I may trust him about work. So I may also trust him to water my plants, even though I don't know anything about how responsible he is with plants or how good he is at remembering those things. Based on the trust that I've built for him at work and his responsibility there and the calculations I can make about him in that case, that may carry over to help me understand more how to trust him in this other context. So then the question when we're talking about social network analysis for trust is, how do we measure it? I mentioned before that some people are more trusting than others. This is called a propensity to trust. And that's one thing that we can start to measure. And there's a great way to measure this with this experiment called the investment game. So here's the game. You're given $10 and you can keep all of it, or you can invest any amount of that $10 with an unknown person. So this is someone you don't know. Whatever you choose to invest is tripled and given to that unknown person. So if you decide to invest $5 of the 10 you got, the unknown person is going to get 15. If you invest all $10, the unknown person gets 30. And then that unknown person has the option of either keeping all the money or returning any amount of it to you as a return on your investment. So for example, you get $10, you invest $5, $15 ends up with the unknown person, and that unknown person may say, well, I know that the original person invested $5, so I'm going to give them $7 back. So you invested $5, you get $7 back, and then the unknown person gets to keep the rest of it, the other $8. They also could keep everything and give you nothing back for your investment, or they could give you all the money they got. So the question, if we're measuring an individual's propensity to trust, is how much do you invest? So this is something that I want you guys to write down. There's going to be a discussion topic on this. Look at the notes for the class. And we're going to compare the differences between what people invest in the class. We can also look at trustworthiness in a similar way. So with trustworthiness, we can play the same game and ask how much money you would return if you received the investment. So if you're that unknown person, now someone that you don't know is investing $5 with you, you end up with 15. What amount are you going to give back to that unknown investor? This can shed a little bit of insight on your trustworthiness. So I would like you guys to pause the lecture here, take some time and think about what you would invest and what you would return, and then go to the discussion section of the website so we can talk about this, tabulate it, and see what happens. There's another great survey that measures trustworthiness that I want you guys to take and see where you fall on the scales. That survey is in the book, and if you look at the notes for this lecture, I'll point you to it. So there's going to be a similar section in the lecture notes and discussion board where we can post and analyze our responses to that. There are other surveys to measure trust. For example, there's one here that's broken down into sections. So if we decided to meet somewhere for lunch, I would be certain that Bob would be there. I could expect Bob to tell me the truth. So if we're measuring trust in specific individuals instead of strangers, we can use surveys like this to say yes or no for a bunch of questions and then come up with a rating of how much we trust that other person on particular topics. We also can repeat the investment game, but instead of having an unknown person that we're investing with or who's investing with us, we can put a particular person in that context. And indeed, we may behave differently in that way. If our mom is the one investing with us, it can be different than some coworker or acquaintance that we don't really get along with. So these are ways of looking at trust in specific other people as opposed to trustworthiness or how trusting a person is in general. The next question then is, how do we take these measurements and apply them in social media? So we want to find a way to do this with people we know online. Some ways to do that are to ask people to explicitly rate how much they trust one another. And there are websites like ePinions that do this. You can make a social network of friends, kind of like you do on Facebook, and then for each one of those friends you can rate how much you trust them. This is really useful, and there's a ton of research, including some of mine, that works with these numbers. But the issue is that most people online are strangers. So even if I rate how much I trust 500 people, there's millions of people who are online who have either written reviews or given other information that I want to know how trustworthy it is, and I don't know them explicitly. So we need to find some way to leverage information that people have shared about the trustworthiness of others to infer how much one person might trust a stranger. This is a process called trust inference. We want to infer trust between two unknown people using a network structure. So here's a little graph at the bottom. We have nodes A, B, and C. We have edges from A to B and from B to C. And I've labeled those edges with this value. This is just T for trust from A to B and the T for trust from B to C. And we want to guess how much person A would trust person C. So we want to infer this value TAC. That's the core question of trust inference. There's lots of ways to do this. I wrote my dissertation on this, but there's a handful of people who worked on building a lot of algorithms that could take a social network where people had explained how much they trust one another and infer values over the network structure. So an example is that we could just find people who we know and we trust some amount and ask them how much to trust this stranger. And if they know the stranger, they'll tell us. And if they don't know the stranger, they'll ask their friends, who will repeat this process. And then once all of my friends have given me back some answer, I can average their responses or do a weighted average so the people I trust more get more weight. Here's just an example of how that process would work. So we have a source here who wants to know how much to trust the sync node over here. So the source will ask its neighbors, A and B. It trusts A on a 7 on a 1 to 10 scale and B at an 8. A knows the sync directly and trusts the sync at a level 8. So the A will report that back to the source. B doesn't know the sync, so B asks its friends, and node C knows the sync and reports that back to B. But D and E don't know the sync, so they ask their friends who know the sync. And you can see each edge has a weight which gets passed back to the previous node, and that node weights the values that come from its neighbors and pass those back until they get back to the source. This is an algorithm called tidal trust, but there's a number of trust inference algorithms that work like this. You don't actually need to understand the details of how this algorithm works, but if you're interested, let me know and I can point you to lots of research in this space. But what I want you to understand is the idea that there are interesting scientific and algorithmic methods out there for understanding and inferring how much people trust one another. There's also methods that don't rely on this explicit ranking of trust of our neighbors, because if you go to Facebook, we haven't rated how much we trust our friends on Facebook. So there are also methods for inferring trust based on that. So there are also methods for inferring trust based on other information about our similarity with people, similar to what we discuss with tie strength and inferring that based on Facebook. So we've talked about the definition of trust, how to measure it, how to apply it in social networks, and then what are the applications that we can use it for. So one example is filtering information. So if you go to, say, Amazon and you look at a book, oftentimes it has hundreds of reviews. One example that I like to talk about is when I was buying a new copy of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I was looking through the reviews out of curiosity, and there were a bunch of reviews in there that said things like, "This book is stupid, and it's totally not a scary book, and I don't know why everybody says it was so great." And these reviews were posted by high school freshmen who had been forced to read the book in their English class, and they said what they thought about it and posted it up there. Now, those reviews could be really useful for another 13 or 14-year-old who's being forced to read this book, but they're not really useful for me who really likes that kind of literature. And so if I can find people who I trust regarding their opinions of books, and then can filter or sort the reviews based on how trustworthy the reviewer is, the information becomes much more useful to me. The same thing goes for a 14-year-old. They may not want a professor's review of the book. They may want reviews from other people like them, and so their trust ratings would be different, and thus they could filter out different reviewers. Sorting is another application. So, for example, show Facebook posts from my most trusted friends first and least trusted friends last. Facebook tries to do this automatically, not so much with trust, but in terms of what they think you'll be interested in. But the idea is the same. There are times that we're looking at updates where we want to look at the most trusted things first, and sorting is a way that we can do that based on the trust we have in the author of the information. And finally, there's aggregating information. We'll eventually talk a little bit more about recommender systems, but the basic idea is they suggest items they think you might be interested in. So Amazon has a recommender system. After you buy a book, it says you might also be interested in these titles. There's also things like Netflix where it'll show you a rating for a movie. It'll say the average rating for this movie is, say, 3 stars, but the rating for what we think you'll like is 3.5 stars. So it thinks you'll like it a little bit more than average. That's a way of aggregating people's ratings, and it's usually done by estimating how similar your tastes are to another person's. But trust can work very well for this kind of thing, and that's one way that we can take a bunch of numeric information like ratings and average them using trust as a weight instead of using similarity or other things as a weight. So, in conclusion, trust has an element of risk and an element of belief in another person. That's the core of the definition of trust. There are a lot of ways to estimate trust that users have in their friends, and we looked at some example tests to do that. In social media, we want to know how much to trust strangers, and there's computational methods to do that. And finally, trust can be used to improve the way people interact with information in social media. Okay, so that's it for trust. A lot of discussion on this topic, so please take your notes that you've done during the lecture, come back and we'll do some more talking about that on the website.